Hi, my name is Jack Wallen and I'm here once again with another Linux 101. Today, we're going to talk about Arch Linux. Yeah, Arch freaking Linux. What is Arch Linux? Well, it's a Linux distribution. It's a Linux distribution that was started back in 2002. Cannot remember the name of the young man that started it, but ever since 2002, Arch Linux has had sort of a bad reputation. What is that bad reputation? For being hard. As if Linux didn't need yet another reason for people to think, oh, that's too hard, I can't use it, oh no. Well, now, okay. In the early days of Arch Linux, actually in the midpoint of Arch Linux, all the way up to the midpoint, even beyond that, there was a very challenging aspect of Arch Linux. What was that aspect, you ask? The installation. That's right. The installation of Arch Linux was really, really challenging for a lot of people. Essentially, you edited a text file that could get very large, and then you ran the installer. If you didn't get the text file correct, the installation would fail. I installed Arch Linux back in those days, and it was not easy, especially compared to other distributions. And you're probably asking yourself, why? Why would anybody create a Linux distribution that's hard to install, especially when you have the likes of Ubuntu and Linux Mint and all of the other Linux distributions that have a simple point-and-click installer? Linux has gotten to the point now where, and I say this often, if you can install an application, you can install Linux. It's really that easy. So why in the world would we want to have a Linux distribution that contradicts that? We've already got Gentoo Linux, which is really challenging to install. Why do we need Arch Linux? Well, especially when there are distributions based on Arch Linux like Manjaro that are incredibly easy to install. Manjaro has a point-and-click installer. Very easy. Very, very easy. But Arch is still very popular for a good reason. Let me tell you why I believe that Arch is very popular. I think of Arch Linux, now bear with me here, I think of Arch Linux as the Burger King of Linux. What? Fast food? Burger King? What? Huh? Well, prior to Burger King adopting that ridiculous "You rule" slogan, it had another slogan, which was "Have it your way." And that's what Arch Linux excels at. Essentially, what you can do with the Arch Linux installer is install the exact version of Linux you want. You can pick the kernel. You can pick the sound server. You can pick the desktop you want. You can only install the applications you want. Essentially, when you get done installing Arch Linux, you have a unique distribution that is tailored specifically for you and your needs. That's a wonderful thing. You cannot deny the wonder and power and beauty of such a thing. And it's great. When I install Arch Linux, when it reboots and I log in for the first time, I know that distribution has exactly what I want on it. And I also know it's going to be very reliable, because that's a big part of Arch Linux. Now, there's another reason why I believe that Arch Linux is so popular, especially among the Linux crowd. With the Arch Linux installer, especially if you go the full manual mode, you learn a whole lot about your computer. You learn about partitioning and all sorts of things that you won't learn when you're installing a GUI-based, a distribution with a GUI-based installer. You don't really get your fingers that dirty during those installers. So Arch Linux gives you the exact distribution you want and helps you learn more about your hardware. That's really cool. And it's another, those are two of the reasons why so many people like to use Arch Linux, besides the stability and reliability, the security, and all the other reasons that people already use Linux. Now, I want to dispel the myths that Arch Linux is too hard for you to install. Okay, so here's what I've done. Before I started filming this video, I got on my desktop computer, fired up VirtualBox, and created a virtual machine for Arch Linux for the installation. And I ran the installation, and I got a screen grab of it. And it's going to be right there. It's going to go start to finish, from start of the installation process all the way to first login. Now, I'm not going to sit here and detail everything, but once it starts, which is going to happen right now, you're going to watch it happen. It's going to fly by. And here's the thing. What's happening over there, that's in real time. I didn't modify anything. It's in real time. So, and I timed it because I was using Simple Screen Recorder to record it. I saw, and it was just over 5 minutes from start to finish. From start to first login, it was just over 5 minutes. That's about the same as installing Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Elementary OS, Rhino Linux. 5 minutes. And as you're watching, you'll see pretty much you boot. Here's what you do. You download the ISO, the live ISO of Arch Linux. And in this case, because I'm using VirtualBox, I create a virtual machine and I use that ISO to base as the initial disk. Start it up. And once it boots, you're going to land on a prompt, the bash prompt. Now bash prompt is a super user. So you have admin privileges. And all you have to do is fire up the command arch install. And what that's going to do is going to present you with a menu, a text-based menu that you use your cursor keys on your keyboard and your enter key on your keyboard to select what you want. So you can go, say, for example, you can go to hardware or to kernel and select the kernel you want. You could go to partitioning. And then here's the cool thing about it, because prior to the Arch install script, you had to manually partition your drive before you can run the installer. So with Arch install, you go to partition drives and you can select the default, which is best guess. It's going to take its best guess at partitioning your drive for Arch Linux. And it works every time. And then you could select your sound server. You can select which desktop you want. And then you can select which packages you want. Now, when you select which packages you want, you type the package you want, like Firefox, which is what I installed on this one. And I believe it's comma separated, because I usually don't bother installing a lot of applications during this because I can install them with Pacman after the fact. But you can install like Firefox and LibreOffice and Audacity and GIMP, whatever you need. And then you go down and you then go to install, and it will run, and then it will start the installation process. And that's it. That's it. There's very little manual. Okay, I just remembered. You do need to configure your internet connection. And that's easy too, because it's going to automatically detect the interface, and then you could select it to use DHCP, so automatic IP address configuration. And because if you don't do this during the installation, networking won't work when you first boot up. I've made that mistake a couple of times, forgetting to configure the network interface. And then what you have to do is you have to configure it manually after you've logged in to the desktop. So once it's installed, once it finishes the installation, it's going to ask you if you want to go back into the chroot or chroot, or however you want to pronounce it, environment. I always say no, and I just reboot. And in the process of rebooting, then, and in the VirtualBox instance, you'll notice that I go to boot from hard drive. Yeah, I could have just shut it down, gone into the settings of the virtual machine, and deleted the ISO image, and then it'll boot just fine as normal. But if you're installing this on bare metal, you don't have to worry about that. You just have to remove the installation media, and you're good to go. And when you log in for the first time, you've got Linux. You've got Arch Linux. It's done. It's ready for you to go. You can open up a terminal window and install whatever you want with Pacman, like Pacman-S GIMP. You could install something like Octopi, or is it pronounced PAMAC, P-A-M-A-C, which is another GUI for installing applications. You can install Flatpak to install other applications. So as you can see, the installation of Arch Linux is not nearly as hard as people make it out to be. Yes, we are talking about a text-based installer. There is no fancy Wundermus GUI that you can just point and click through. Yes, so you have to deal with that. But as you just saw, it's a lot easier than you think. Now, it will be really cool, and I think that the developers of Arch should consider this, to migrate that text-based installer at least to a simplified GUI. So, and now here's the reason for that. I believe that perception is really important. So when someone is relatively new to Linux, if they go to try to install Arch Linux, regardless of how easy the Arch install command is and how easy the text-based menu system is, it's still going to put them off, because people new to Linux don't want to futz with the command line. They just don't. They want GUI applications, they want point and click, they want user-friendly, they want simplicity. And if the developers would simply take that wonderful little text-based menu and GUIfy it, it doesn't have to be like a Calamares installer. It doesn't have to be that much. Just a simple GUI application. So instead of using your keyboard and your space bar to make the selections, you could actually use your mouse and point and click. Now, I realize this is one of the problems, is that the Arch installer, when you boot Arch up, it boots into text only. So there isn't a graphical element to that. So, and I realize that if you just make a standard installer like you have on Ubuntu, then you may as well just have Manjaro. So, but there has to be a way, and I don't know of this way because I'm not a developer, but some way to simplify, or not simplify, but make that installation look a little easier to new users. And maybe that just requires booting into a bare minimum X11 or Wallen session, such that there is just a window and a GUI terminal. Maybe, I don't know. I'm just spitballing here. And it's probably not possible. And truth be told, Arch users aren't going to want that anyway. They like their distribution as it is. They like the complexity, and I understand that. I remember back in the day, this is kind of silly, but I remember back in the day, the first time I successfully installed Arch Linux, it was almost like it was almost like winning a Boy Scout badge. I got my Arch Linux badge. And the only way to improve that is to get my Gentoo badge, because I already had all the other ones. I just needed those two to finish it up. So there was a certain sense of pride after having installed Arch Linux. Now, these days that doesn't really exist because the installation is so much simplified than it was previously. But you get the idea that there is just something to be said about successfully installing something that's a little harder than the average bear, right? You've experienced it, sure. I know you have. I also remember this was a really cool moment back in my really early days of before I actually became a tech journalist, before I started writing about open source and Linux. I had taken a hiatus from acting because I was a professional actor for a very long time. And during that hiatus is when I discovered Linux. I decided that I was going to go back to college, even though I had 2 degrees. I went back to college to study computer information systems. There's a good story there. But I had discovered there was a Linux users group on campus. And prior to me going to the first meeting, I had just installed Wine and got Diablo running on Linux. And I went into this user group meeting and I told everybody, I was like, hey, I got Diablo running on Linux. And everybody was like, woo, wow, that's awesome. And there just happens to be this guy from this website there who they were recruiting someone to write about Linux. And they said, we're looking for somebody to write about Linux. And before he could get the next sentence out, I raised my hand and said, I'm your guy. And they hired me right there. And so but when I went to that user group and I told them about getting Diablo running on Linux, it was an accomplishment for me. And it was a big accomplishment at that point because it was something that not everybody had done. And I succeeded in it. And the same thing holds true with installing Arch Linux. Now, for those of you who have been using Linux for a very long time, you're probably thinking, yeah, Arch Linux is easy to install. There's nothing to it. It's just a simple script. Well, think about the time when you first started using Linux. Think about your first instance, the first time you ever installed Linux. It was a little foreign to you, right? Sometimes I will tell people on occasion when they ask me, when they say, "Oh, Linux is too hard. I can't do that." I say, "Okay, think about it in terms of religion." I know, it's not a good subject to talk about, but hear me out. Let's say, for example, you were raised Methodist. Okay? And your best friend says, hey, come to church with me on Sunday. You're like, okay. Well, your best friend's a Catholic. So you go to the Catholic service and you realize, oh, there's some similarities. Okay, there are some things that they do differently, but I can adjust. I can do this. Next time you have a Jewish friend and your Jewish friend say, hey, come with me. And you say, okay, I'll come. So Saturday, you show up with them and you're like, okay, well, this is very different. I see some similarities, but I can adjust. Of course, there's a little bit more to it. If you wanted to jump from Methodist to Judaism, but that's not the point. The point is that you can get used to just about anything. It's just like jumping from one browser to another. They all essentially do the same thing. It's just that when you go to install Arch Linux, instead of using Chrome or Firefox or Opera or Arc, you're using Lynx, the old text-based browser. It can get the job done, and it takes a little bit of effort to go, okay, how do I do this? I'm not quite sure, but you can do it. And in the end, when the installation is done, you have a full-blown desktop that you can log into and use. And that's the truth of the matter is this. The only complication with Arch Linux is the installer. And as you just witnessed over there, it's really not that hard. So when the installation is done, you log in, you'll be like, oh, okay. Log into GNOME or KDE or Budgie or Enlightenment, whatever desktop you've chosen. You go, okay, well, now it's easy. Even the package installation, the package manager, Pacman, it's not that hard. Pacman, Pacman dash capital S GIMP. Bam, you've just installed GIMP. Arch Linux does get a bad rap. And I believe that it's an unwarranted bad rap. And if you want to try out Linux, I suggest you stop worrying about it being so hard, fire up a virtual machine, and install it. You'll be shocked at how easy it actually is to install. And when it's done, you've got a reliable, secure, user-friendly operating system on your computer that will serve you well for years. And that's really the gist of Arch Linux. Now, if you want to know a bit more history about Arch Linux, about how it came about and all that, you can Google it, or you can DuckDuckGo it, Bing it, whatever you want, whatever search engine you use. You can find out more about Arch Linux, and I highly recommend that you do. And more importantly, I recommend that you try it. It's not going to hurt you. Not gremlins and demons are not going to jump out of the screen and demand a sacrifice in order to finish the installation. That's not how it works. You're not going to lose your sanity trying to install it. You're going to be surprised. Don't neglect Arch Linux. Don't shrug it off. Don't brush it aside. Try it. And trust me when I tell you, it's a really, really good Linux distribution. Okay, my lovely friends, that's all I've got about Arch Linux. And next, I don't know what I'm going to do next time. I will eventually start doing more of these for different distributions because it's fun. But at some point, they're going to be like, well, okay, you've talked about Ubuntu. You don't need to talk about all the spin-offs and blah, 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 blah. So I don't know what I'm going to talk about next time, but you can bet that it'll be about Linux. And you can bet I'm going to do my best to be informative and maybe, just maybe, entertain you for a little bit. Anyway, thank you very, very kindly for dropping by this little channel of mine. I hope you've learned something today. I hope I've challenged you, and I hope that you will stop watching this when I sign off and you will download Arch Linux and install it and go, hey, this is really cool. I installed Arch Linux. Huzzah! Thank you again, and I hope that you and everyone you know and love have a wonderful, wonderful day.